You're fired if you feed that hungry old man.
You're fired if you feed that hungry old man. Charles's voice thundered through the golden doors of the mansion, sharp as glass shattering in the night. His finger stabbed the air, inches from Martha's pale face, while the silver tray in her trembling hands rattled with untouched food. Behind her, the crystal chandeliers blazed, mocking the hollow darkness in Samuel's eyes. The old man's hands outstretched, empty, shaking. Martha's lips parted, no sound escaping. The scent of roasted lamb and fine wine drifted into the cold street where Samuel stood barefoot, his clothes torn, his stomach growling louder than his voice could beg. Charles's jaw was clenched, his tailored suit immaculate, his disdain heavier than the gold crown-shaped handles of his mansion doors. Around them, silence, broken only by the desperate whisper of the city beyond the iron gates. She was just a cleaning lady, hired to scrub marble floors no one touched, and polish silver spoons that never knew hunger. He was a billionaire CEO, the untouchable king of this palace of excess. And the old man? To Charles, he was nothing but a stain on the sidewalk. But the secret hidden in Samuel's weary eyes would turn this night into a storm, and what happened next would silence them all. Before we begin this emotional story, tell us in the comments from which city you are watching, and don't forget to leave your like to keep following us. The tray slipped slightly in Martha's hands, one silver fork clinking against the porcelain as though betraying her heartbeat. She lowered her eyes, hiding the storm rising within them. Charles's shadow stretched across the polished marble floor of the entrance hall, sharp under the glow of the chandelier. Behind the iron gate, Samuel remained still, his lips trembling in silence. "Martha," Charles hissed, each syllable carved with venom, "this house is not a soup kitchen. Do your job or leave." He adjusted his cufflinks, the diamonds glittering with arrogance, before turning his back as if she had already ceased to exist. The heavy doors began to close with a slow, merciless creak. Martha swallowed hard. The scent of roasted lamb on the untouched tray made her stomach twist, not with hunger but with guilt. She had seen Samuel for days outside those gates, sitting in the cold like a forgotten statue. She knew his voice, rough and weak, whispering, "Please." She had turned away before, out of fear of losing her only job, the roof over her head, the paycheck that kept her mother's medicine paid for. But tonight, when his sunken eyes met hers, she felt her own soul crack. The doors shut, sealing Samuel outside. The silence that followed was suffocating. Martha carried the tray back toward the dining room, where a feast waited for a man who never ate half of what was served. Crystal glasses stood untouched, fine wines uncorked, a table built for 10 yet occupied by one. Charles sat at the head of it, scrolling through his phone, his expression colder than the ice in the bucket beside him. "Put it down," he ordered, without looking. His voice was casual now, as though the fury at the door was nothing but routine. Martha obeyed, placing the food carefully before him, though her hands shook. Her eyes wandered to the golden reflection in the polished silverware. How could one man live in so much excess while another starved steps away? She lingered too long. Charles noticed. "You're still here?" His eyes flicked up, sharp, impatient. Martha bowed her head and stepped back quickly, retreating toward the kitchen. The voices of the other maids hushed as she entered. They had heard everything. Their eyes, wide with fear, avoided hers. None of them would dare defy Charles. He was more than their employer. He was their judge, jury, and executioner in this house. Alone later in her tiny room tucked behind the laundry quarters, Martha sat on the edge of her narrow bed. The distant hum of the city seeped through the thin window pane. She thought of Samuel's hollow face, of his cracked lips forming her name though she had never spoken it to him. She thought of Charles's threat, heavy as a stone chained to her chest. Her fingers traced the cross she wore around her neck, worn smooth by years of worry. She whispered into the quiet, "I can't just watch him die out there." A tear slipped down her cheek, not loud, not dramatic, just a quiet surrender to the truth she had buried for too long. The moonlight stretched across the floor, pale and merciless. Martha knew what she had to do. She stood, tucked a piece of bread from the kitchen into her apron, and with trembling steps, she moved toward the gates once more. And in the distance, Samuel's shadow waited, motionless, watching. Dinner was finished, though half the plates on the long mahogany table remained untouched. Charles rose, his chair scraping against the marble as he strode to the grand piano in the corner. He pressed a single key, the note echoing hollow through the vast dining hall. Then silence again. He wasn't playing. He only liked the sound of possession, the reminder that even music belonged to him. Martha cleared the plates quietly, her movements as discreet as shadows. She caught sight of his reflection in the glass cabinet, his tall frame framed by oil paintings of ancestors who stared down with painted superiority. She wondered if he ever felt alone in this mansion built for kings, but occupied by one bitter man. Charles poured himself a glass of red wine and sat beneath the chandelier, scrolling through messages on his phone. The light of the screen cast a cold glow across his face. Martha knew better than to linger. She collected the last plate and slipped into the kitchen, where the faint ticking of the old clock seemed louder than the city outside. When everyone else had retreated to their quarters, Martha sat at the small wooden table in the corner of the kitchen, her head resting in her hands. The smell of roasted lamb still clung to her fingers, but her stomach knotted at the thought of Samuel waiting outside the gates with nothing. She imagined his cracked lips whispering again, "Please," and her chest tightened until she could hardly breathe. The other maids had warned her. Charles fired without hesitation. Last winter, one of the gardeners had been caught slipping leftovers to a homeless child near the gates. By morning, he was gone. No reference, no severance, nothing. Charles had said, "Compassion breeds weakness. I don't pay for weakness." And yet, as Martha sat in that cold kitchen, her resolve began to shift. She thought of her mother's face, frail, pale, lying in a hospital bed years ago. She had begged for water in her final hours, but they couldn't afford the treatment, couldn't even afford basic comfort. Hunger and thirst had been her last companions. Martha had sworn then she would never let another soul suffer if she had the power to stop it. Her fingers reached into her apron pocket, where the small piece of bread she had hidden earlier waited. She clutched it tightly, her hands trembling. The weight of her decision pressed against her chest, but so did the memory of Samuel's eyes, familiar somehow, as if he carried a piece of her own story within him. Midnight struck. The mansion was silent, wrapped in luxury and shadows. Martha rose, moving with careful steps past the grand staircase, past the portraits of men who had built empires on other people's broken backs. She reached the kitchen door that led out toward the garden and the gates beyond. Her breath misted in the cold as she stepped outside. The night air bit her cheeks, the silence broken only by the rustling of trees swaying against the city wind. She walked across the gravel path, her shoes crunching with every hesitant step. And there, beneath the iron gates, Samuel sat hunched over, his hands clasped together as if in silent prayer. Martha's throat tightened. She pulled the bread from her apron, her fingers shaking. She crossed the final distance and crouched down before him. "Here," she whispered, her voice almost breaking. Samuel lifted his head. His eyes, though weary and sunken, glimmered under the faint streetlight. He reached out, and as his fingers brushed hers, he murmured something that froze Martha's breath in her lungs. He said her name. Martha's fingers froze as the old man's voice drifted into the night, rough yet deliberate. "Martha." He said it as though he had carried her name across decades, as though it belonged not to this moment, but to something long buried. Her breath caught. She hadn't told him her name. She hadn't even spoken to him until tonight. She glanced toward the mansion, its towering silhouette looming like a sentinel in the dark. If Charles saw her kneeling at the gates, the bread in her hands, it would be the end. And yet, she couldn't move. How do you know me?" she whispered, her voice trembling like the flame of a candle in wind. Samuel chewed slowly, his frail body savoring each bite of the bread as though it were a banquet. Between bites, he lifted his gaze to her. His eyes, though sunken with hunger, carried a sharpness that unsettled her. "Names are not easily forgotten," he murmured. "Not when they carry the echo of kindness." Martha frowned, confusion knitting her brow. "We've never met." Samuel's lips curved in a faint, broken smile. "Not in the way you think." His gaze shifted past her, toward the mansion's golden windows. "But I knew this house long before you ever walked its halls. I knew the man who built it, and I knew the boy who was raised inside." Martha turned slightly, following his stare. The house glowed against the dark sky, a fortress of excess, its walls seeming to listen. Her pulse quickened. "You mean Charles?" Samuel's silence was answer enough. He looked back at her, his voice dropping into a whisper. "Be careful with him. He carries shadows darker than these gates." The words rattled through her. She had worked for Charles long enough to know his cruelty, but there was something in Samuel's tone, a weight of history, that unsettled her deeper than any of Charles's threats ever had. "Why are you here?" Martha asked, her voice hushed, urgent. "Why stay outside this house if you know he despises you?" Samuel's hand trembled as he lifted the last piece of bread. "Because some debts are not paid in money. Some truths cannot be buried forever." Before Martha could press him further, a sudden creak sliced through the night. Her blood ran cold. The sound came from the mansion, the balcony above. She looked up. A figure stood in the shadows of the upper floor, a tall silhouette, motionless, watching. Martha's heart hammered. She rose quickly, brushing crumbs from her apron, forcing composure onto her face. "I have to go," she whispered, stepping back. Samuel's voice stopped her. "Don't let fear chain you. What you choose tonight will decide more than your future. It may decide his." Her breath caught, but she dared not look back. With hurried steps, she slipped through the garden path, the gravel crunching beneath her shoes like shattered glass. The kitchen door swallowed her into the mansion's silence once more. Upstairs, the shadow moved. Charles's eyes burned through the night, his jaw tight as he turned from the balcony. He had seen enough. Morning light poured through the tall windows of the dining hall, bouncing off crystal vases and polished marble. Charles sat at the head of the table, his newspaper spread wide, though his eyes weren't on the words. He hadn't slept. He had stood on that balcony long into the night, watching Martha's betrayal unfold in the shadows. When she entered, carrying the silver pot of coffee, his gaze sliced through her like a blade. "Set it down," he ordered, his voice low, calm, the kind of calm that warned of an oncoming storm. Martha obeyed, carefully placing the pot on the table. The room felt heavy, too quiet, as though even the walls were holding their breath. She clasped her hands to hide their trembling. Charles folded the newspaper with deliberate precision, each crease sharp, controlled. Then he raised his eyes. "Do you think I don't see?" His voice was cold steel. "Do you think the walls of this house don't speak to me?" Martha's throat tightened. "Sir, He slammed his fist onto the table, the crystal glasses rattling. "Do not lie to me!" His voice thundered through the hall. "You dare feed that wretch at my gates? After I warned you?" The silence that followed was unbearable. The other servants froze in the doorway, wide-eyed, clutching trays like shields. Martha's lips parted, but no defense came. Her heart pounded so hard she could barely breathe. Charles stood, his chair scraping violently against the marble. He walked toward her, slow, deliberate, each footstep echoing like a countdown. When he stopped before her, his hand snatched the silver plate she still carried from breakfast. In a single, cruel motion, he hurled it across the floor. It shattered against the tiles, fragments scattering at her feet. "Do you know what happens to servants who disobey me?" He hissed, his face inches from hers. Martha's eyes burned with tears she refused to shed. She lowered her gaze, her chest rising and falling in quick, shallow breaths. Then, a voice, hoarse but firm. "She doesn't deserve your cruelty, Charles." The room stilled. Every head turned toward the open doorway at the far end of the hall. Samuel stood there, gaunt and frail, his coat ragged, his hair wild, yet his posture unbroken. His presence was an insult to the luxury around him, a crack in Charles's perfect world. Charles's face twisted, rage flooding his veins. "How dare you step foot in my house?" he spat, his voice sharp enough to cut glass. "You have no place here." But Samuel did not flinch. His eyes, though weary, met Charles's with a fire that had nothing to do with hunger. "This place was built with more than your money, and you know it." The words dropped like stones in a still pond, their ripples spreading through the hall. The servants exchanged confused glances, their fear shifting into curiosity. Martha's heart raced. Samuel wasn't just a beggar at the gates. He was something else. Charles's fists clenched at his sides. His mask of control wavered for the briefest moment, a flicker of recognition crossing his face before he buried it under fury. "Get him out of here!" he roared, his voice cracking like thunder. But Samuel didn't move. His eyes stayed locked on Charles, steady, unyielding. And in that silence, a secret hung in the air, waiting to be revealed. The hall was frozen in a silence so sharp it felt like glass about to shatter. Charles's command still echoed against the marble walls, but Samuel did not move. Instead, the old man stepped forward, his cane tapping against the floor with deliberate weight, as if each step was a challenge. "Leave," Charles barked again, his face red with fury. "Before I have you dragged out onto the street." Samuel's lips curled in something that wasn't quite a smile. His voice was calm, unhurried, carrying a resonance that made the servants lean in despite themselves. "Do you threaten me the same way your father threatened me, Charles?" The words landed like a blow. Martha felt the air leave her chest. The servants stiffened, whispering nervously among themselves. Charles froze for a fraction of a second before his mask snapped back into place. "You know nothing of my father," he snapped, but his voice had lost its sharp edge. Samuel's eyes narrowed. "I knew him better than you ever did. I knew the man behind the empire, the deals he made, the betrayals he buried." He took another step closer, his frail frame shaking but his gaze unbreakable. "And I know what you did to inherit what was never yours to take." Martha's heart pounded. She stared at Samuel, then at Charles, searching for any sign that this was madness. But Charles's face said everything. His jaw tightened. His eyes darted with the frantic calculation of a man whose past had just clawed its way back into the present. "Enough!" Charles thundered, but his voice trembled. He reached for the decanter of wine on the table, pouring a glass with hands that weren't as steady as they once were. He downed it in a single gulp, as if liquid courage could drown the truth. Samuel's cane struck the floor. "You can silence your servants. You can silence Martha, but you cannot silence me, Charles, not anymore." The tension was suffocating. The other staff exchanged nervous glances, their loyalty cracking under the weight of the revelation. Martha stood rooted, torn between terror and a strange, rising sense of vindication. For years she had felt the cruelty of this man, and now, finally, she saw him bleed, not from a wound, but from a truth. Charles leaned forward, his face inches from Samuel's. "You're a liar." A bitter old man clinging to fantasies. Samuel's voice dropped to a whisper, so low that everyone strained to hear. "Then tell them why you've kept the East Wing locked for 20 years. The blood drained from Charles's face. For the first time since Martha had known him, the billionaire looked shaken, cornered. His lips pressed into a thin line, but no words came. Martha's breath caught. She glanced at the other servants. Their eyes were wide, their fear shifting into curiosity, even defiance. The East Wing. She had cleaned every inch of this mansion except for those doors, always locked, always forbidden. Samuel straightened his fragile body as best as he could, his voice strong despite the years. "I warned your father the truth would not stay buried. I told him the sins of the past would return. And here I stand, Charles. I am that return." Charles's glass slipped from his hand, shattering across the floor. Red wine bled into the marble like a spreading wound. His empire of silence was crumbling, one secret at a time. The silence after Samuel's words seemed to stretch forever. Martha's pulse pounded in her ears as she looked at Charles, his face pale, his composure cracking. The servants lingered in the hall, their fear of Charles momentarily eclipsed by a hunger for answers. Samuel's hand trembled on his cane as he turned his gaze to them all. "You deserve to know the truth," he said softly, though his voice carried like a church bell in the stillness. "Not just about him, but about me." Martha swallowed hard. The air shifted, as if the walls themselves leaned closer to listen. "I was not always like this," Samuel began, his eyes distant, his words dragging the room into a different time. "There was a day when I wore suits finer than Charles's, when I stepped into boardrooms as his father's equal, his partner, his friend." The servants gasped quietly. Martha's hands flew to her mouth. "I built this empire with him," Samuel continued. "We started with nothing but an idea, a company that would grow brick by brick, dollar by dollar. I worked the numbers, closed the deals, built the trust that opened doors. He had ambition, yes, but it was my sweat, my sacrifices that gave that ambition a spine. His eyes flicked to Charles, sharp as broken glass. And then greed did the rest. Martha could see it in her mind's eye, two young men in a smoky office, shaking hands, building something that would change their lives. Then betrayal creeping in like a shadow over light. Samuel's voice wavered, but not from weakness, from anger long buried. Your father forged my signature. He rewrote the contracts, pushed me out with lies and threats. In one night, I lost everything. My home, my savings, my name. He lifted a shaking hand to his chest, and all I had left was dignity, so I walked away with nothing but that. Charles's jaw tightened, his face contorted in rage. You expect them to believe this? Samuel cut him off with a glare. You were a boy then, Charles, a frightened boy watching from the staircase as your father cast me into the street. Do you deny it? Charles opened his mouth, but no words came. His silence spoke louder than any denial. Martha felt her chest tighten. She looked at Samuel differently now, not as a beggar, but as a man robbed of his life, his history stolen by the very walls around her. The realization hit like a storm. This mansion, these riches, were built on betrayal. I stayed silent for years, Samuel said, his voice dropping. I tried to rebuild, to forgive. But the city is merciless. I fell lower and lower still, until the streets claimed me. His eyes glistened. Yet no matter how deep the hunger, no matter how bitter the cold, I never forgot who I was. And I never forgot who took it from me. The servants stared at Charles, whispers rising like wind through leaves. Martha's heart pounded with a dangerous thought. The mighty billionaire was not untouchable. He was standing on a throne built from stolen ground. Samuel steadied himself against his cane, his voice firm. I am not here for pity. I am here for truth. And truth cannot be locked behind the east wing forever. Charles's face twisted with fury, but beneath it Martha caught a flicker of something else. Fear. The servants had scattered, whispering through the corridors like startled birds, but the echo of Samuel's revelation still lingered in the air. Charles stood stiff, his fists clenched at his sides, his chest rising and falling with barely controlled rage. Enough of this circus, he spat, his voice raw. He snapped his fingers, and one of the butlers rushed to shut the doors, sealing the hall from prying eyes. Charles reached into his pocket, pulled out a sleek black wallet, and threw a stack of bills onto the polished table. The notes fanned out, green against the gleaming wood. Take it, Charles hissed at Samuel. Take this and disappear. Tonight. Never come back. Samuel didn't move. He looked at the money as if it was something rotten, something unworthy of touch. Slowly he lifted his eyes, piercing Charles with a steady, weary defiance. Money, he said, his voice carrying the weight of a verdict. That is all you ever learned from your father. You think it can buy loyalty, silence, forgiveness, but it cannot buy back dignity, and it cannot buy back the truth. Martha's breath caught. She felt the invisible line draw itself before her. On one side, the man who paid her wages but crushed her soul. On the other, the broken old man who spoke with a strength richer than gold. Her hands trembled, but for the first time she didn't lower her gaze. Charles noticed. His head snapped toward her, his eyes narrowing. Don't you dare, he growled. Don't you dare take his side. Martha swallowed hard, her voice thin but steady. Maybe he deserves to be heard. The words slipped out before she could stop them. The silence that followed was deafening. Charles's face darkened, his lips curling into something more dangerous than a shout, a smile without warmth. You think kindness will save you. His tone dripped with venom. This man will drag you down with him, and when I crush him, you will be crushed as well. Samuel lifted his cane and tapped it once against the marble, the sound sharp, final. You cannot crush what has already survived the streets, Charles. You cannot break what has already been broken. Charles's fury snapped. He grabbed the stack of bills from the table and hurled them at Samuel's feet. The money scattered across the floor, a rain of green paper that fluttered uselessly around his tattered shoes. Pick it up, Charles roared. Pick it up and crawl like the beggar you are. But Samuel only stared at him, unmoving. And slowly, to Charles's horror, Martha bent down, not to collect the money, but to pick up one of the shards from the broken plate Charles had smashed earlier. She held it in her hand, the sharp edge catching the light. Her voice was calm, but her eyes burned. "You can throw all the money in the world, Mr. Hale," she said softly, "but some things will never belong to you." Charles's jaw clenched, his fury boiling over. "Then you've chosen your side," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "And I will bury you both for it." The storm broke not with thunder, but with voices. Whispers had spread like wildfire through the mansion, servants murmuring in corners, gardeners pausing their work, the housekeepers lingering in the halls. They all knew something had cracked inside the Hale estate, something that could no longer be hidden. It was dinner hour when it happened. Charles sat at the head of the endless table once again, a plate of roasted duck untouched before him. The air was tense, charged, the silence of the staff louder than words. Martha carried a tray, her steps deliberate, her mind clear for the first time in years. Samuel was there too, frail but upright, standing just beyond the dining hall doors. The servants had allowed him in, their fear outweighed by curiosity, and perhaps by quiet solidarity. Charles noticed him instantly. His chair screeched against the floor as he rose, his face red with fury. "Get him out of my sight," he bellowed. "This is my house, not a shelter." The servants didn't move. Their eyes darted between Martha and Samuel, waiting. Something invisible hung in the air, as if they all knew history was about to bend. Martha stepped forward, her tray trembling only slightly in her hands. She set it down not before Charles, but before Samuel. Slowly, with care, she lifted the silver lid and revealed a plate of steaming food. The scent of warm bread, roasted potatoes, and tender meat filled the hall. Gasps rippled through the servants. Charles's voice exploded. "You're fired if you feed that hungry old man." The phrase slashed through the hall like lightning, the same venom he had thrown at her that night by the gates. His hand slammed the table, rattling the silverware. His face twisted, the veins in his neck straining, but Martha did not flinch. She met his eyes, her voice steady and unshaken. "Then, fire me, Mr. Hale. But tonight, he eats." The silence that followed was seismic. The servants, who had bowed their heads in obedience for years, now lifted their gazes. One by one, they straightened their backs. Their fear dissolved into something else, defiance. Samuel's trembling hands reached for the food, and when he took the first bite, tears welled in his eyes. It wasn't just hunger he fed, it was dignity returned, if only for a moment. Charles looked around, wild, as though the walls themselves were betraying him. "You all dare stand against me?" he roared, his voice cracking under the weight of disbelief. No one answered. The silence of the staff was louder than his rage. Their eyes, every single one, were fixed not on their employer, but on the woman who had dared to stand against him. Charles's face contorted with fury. He pointed at the door, spittle flying from his lips. "Get out, both of you, and never set foot in this house again." Martha didn't move. She calmly helped Samuel to his feet, steadying his fragile body. She looked at Charles one last time, her voice soft but sharp as glass. "This house may be yours, Mr. Hale, but respect will never obey you." And together, Martha and Samuel walked out, leaving Charles standing alone in the empire of silence he had built. The city's skyline glittered with steel and glass, a fortress of wealth rising into the clouds. At the very top of one of those towers, in a boardroom lined with polished wood and panoramic windows, Charles stood before his empire. The quarterly meeting of Hale Enterprises had begun, and the table was crowded with investors, shareholders, and lawyers. Charles spoke with the confidence of a man used to command, his voice echoing across the room. "Our growth remains unmatched. Our reach expands globally, and those who question my leadership have no place in this company." He paused, letting his words hang like a verdict. The shareholders nodded, some in awe, others in fear. The doors creaked open. At first, no one paid attention. People entered these rooms late all the time, assistants, aides, minor interruptions. But when the shuffle of feet echoed across the marble, heads began to turn. Murmurs spread. Samuel walked in. But this was not the Samuel who had crouched by the mansion gates. His ragged coat was gone. replaced by a pressed suit, clean if modest. His hair, trimmed and combed back, revealed sharp features beneath the weather of time. He still leaned on his cane, but his eyes carried the fire of a man who had been waiting decades for this moment. Beside him walked two attorneys, their briefcases heavy with files. One placed a thick envelope onto the table with a firm thud. Charles froze. His confident mask cracked, the blood draining from his face. "You," he whispered, barely audible. Samuel's voice carried across the boardroom, steady, measured. "Yes, Charles. Me. The partner your father betrayed. The man whose signature was forged, whose contracts were stolen, whose life was left in ruins." Gasps erupted around the table. Shareholders leaned forward, eyes wide, whispering furiously to one another. Lawyers exchanged glances, already sensing the storm brewing. One of Samuel's attorneys opened the envelope, spreading out documents across the glossy wood. Contracts with mismatched signatures, letters of intent, bank records from decades ago. Proof. "Everything is here," Samuel said, his voice strong. "The fraud, the theft, the erasure of my name. For years I survived with nothing, while your father, and then you, lived as kings on what was never yours." He looked directly at Charles. "But the past doesn't stay buried forever." Charles slammed his hand on the table. "This is absurd. Lies from a bitter man who wasted his life on the streets." His voice was loud, desperate, but not convincing. His investors didn't look at him. They looked at the papers, at Samuel, at the cracks spreading through the empire they thought was unshakable. Martha's words echoed in Samuel's mind. "Respect will never obey you." He straightened, shoulders squared, no longer the broken beggar. "From this day forward," Samuel declared, "the truth belongs to everyone in this room, and soon it will belong to the world." The room buzzed with shock, fear, and awe. But in the center of it all, Charles Hale stood trembling. A billionaire CEO suddenly stripped of his invincibility, and for the first time in years, silence fell upon him. Not the silence of power, but the silence of defeat. The boardroom had erupted into chaos. Shareholders spoke over one another, papers rustled, and lawyers scribbled furiously, already plotting how to protect themselves. Yet in the center of it all, Charles stood paralyzed, his empire collapsing around him like glass under a hammer. His voice finally broke through, ragged, desperate. "You think this will take me down? You think some old man's stories and dusty papers can undo decades of power?" Samuel leaned on his cane, his voice calm, resolute. "Not stories, Charles. Evidence. And not just my word. Your father's own signature condemns you. The fortune you flaunt was never yours alone. Justice doesn't always come swiftly, but it comes." The attorneys slid copies of the contracts across the table. Shareholders seized them, scanning with wide eyes. The whispers grew louder, sharper. Words like fraud, lawsuit, and criminal liability spread through the room like sparks on dry grass. Charles turned to them, his voice trembling. "You've profited because of me, because of my leadership." But his pleas sounded hollow, the words of a man watching loyalty dissolve into self-preservation. Then, from the back of the room, another voice rose. It was Martha. She had entered quietly, unnoticed in the uproar, but now every eye turned to her. She stepped forward, her gaze steady. "For years I watched him waste food while men like Samuel starved outside his gates," she said, her voice clear, unwavering. "I scrubbed his floors, I carried his trays, and I saw his cruelty up close. You may call him a leader. I call him what he is. A man who built walls to keep the truth out, but walls crumble, and tonight they have." A hush fell. For the first time, Charles had no words. Samuel turned to Martha, his expression softening. "You gave me food when no one else would. But more than that, you gave me the courage to step back into this room." Martha's eyes glistened. "You gave me the courage to stop being afraid." The lawyers gathered their documents, the shareholders already calling emergency votes. Charles stood alone at the head of the table, his hands gripping the leather chair as if it could anchor him against the tide, pulling everything away. But power is loneliest when it slips from your grasp. In the weeks that followed, newspapers filled with headlines. Fraud exposed at Hale Enterprises. Stolen legacy revealed. Homeless man claims justice after decades. Charles retreated from the public eye, his fortune fractured, his name tainted. But Samuel, no longer a beggar, reclaimed what was his. With a portion of the settlement, he founded a small foundation in the city dedicated to feeding the hungry and sheltering the homeless. And at his side, helping to run it, was Martha. On opening day, the long tables were lined with bread, soup, and warm meals. Dozens of men, women, and children sat with gratitude in their eyes, their laughter filling the hall. Martha walked among them, her apron gone, replaced by a simple blouse and a smile that glowed with quiet strength. Samuel sat at the head of the table, not as a king, not as a billionaire, but as a man restored. He looked at Martha, his voice breaking with emotion. "For years I had nothing, but tonight I have everything that matters." And somewhere far away, in the dim silence of a mansion stripped of its pride, Charles sat alone at a table built for 10, staring at an empty plate. For the first time, his silence wasn't power, it was punishment. Even in the coldest nights, kindness can spark a light that no storm can extinguish. Martha's courage, Samuel's endurance, and even Charles's downfall remind us that life is not measured by what we own, but by what we give. And sometimes the smallest act of compassion can change the course of more than one destiny. And so, what began at the gates of a mansion ended inside the walls of justice. Martha found her voice, Samuel regained his dignity, and even Charles, left alone in silence, was forced to face the truth that money cannot erase. This story reminds us that dignity and compassion are stronger than power and pride, that the smallest act of courage can break the chains of fear, and that no fortune can bury the truth forever. There is always hope where there is kindness. Thank you for staying with us until the end of this heart-touching story. Tell us in the comments which part moved you the most. Subscribe and turn on the bell to receive more stories that inspire and transform. Leave a like if you believe in the invisible strength of dignity and family. And above all, thank you for being part of this community that believes in stories with soul. And before you go, watch the story I leave here on the left. I'm sure it will also move you and make you reflect.